Greetings, friends. I'm Laurie Norton Moffett, Director and CEO of Norman Rockwell Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you for joining us on this National Day on which we honor the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King for a discussion of Norman Rockwell Museum's upcoming exhibition, Imprinted, Illustrating Race. You'll be able to see it at the museum and through many virtual program offerings like this one beginning in June. This exhibit is the result of many months of work by an exceptional group of national scholars, curators, and artists. We are very grateful for their leadership and insight. Imprinted is co-curated by Robyn Phillips-Pendleton, University of Delaware Professor of Visual Communications, whose thesis forms the basis of the exhibition, and by the museum's Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Stephanie Habush-Plunkett. Many funders who believe in the importance of the project are making the exhibition possible. We thank Steven Spielberg and Kate Capshaw's Hearthland Foundation, major sponsor, Travelers, and project support from the Tara Foundation for American Art. Sponsors also include Berkshire Bank, the Dr. Robert C. and Tina Sohn Foundation, the Upper Housatonic Heritage Area, and Mass Humanities. The funding made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and TD Bank is providing curriculum development support. Our discussion today and the focus of the exhibition is to explore the role of published images in shaping our perceptions of race and culture. The exhibition examines historical, stereotypical racial representations that have been imprinted upon us through the mass publication of images. It culminates with the creative accomplishments of contemporary artists and publishers who have shifted the cultural narrative through the creation of positive, inclusive imagery, emphasizing full agency and equity for all. It's important to become aware how illustration influences our cultural perceptions. Images can lift us up, and they can be deployed to establish negative and demeaning perceptions, as happened, often with intention, during formative centuries of published images in the United States. It is our hope that this exploration and its related programs will help us all to gain deeper understanding of how images that have been published may have affected our own perceptions and beliefs. We hope that the voices represented in the exhibition, together with their inspiring stories, will bring us all closer together in mutual understanding. Before I introduce our co-curators, I would like to invite you to direct any questions you have to the Q&A on the bottom of your screen for discussion at the conclusion of the curator's presentation. And now please welcome Robyn Phillips-Pendleton and Stephanie Plunkett.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see you. We're very thankful that you've taken time this afternoon to spend with us and to hear a little bit about the work that we've been doing. As Laurie said, we are an institution, one of the rare ones actually, that is focused solely on the art of illustration. So we have really been fortunate to collect and also present many exhibitions focused on art that is mass circulated, art that without us thinking about it has a tremendous impact on the way we think and feel about things. And in many ways, it is hidden in plain sight sometimes. It has actually been a great honor for me to work with Robyn Phillips-Pendleton on this exhibition, Imprinted, Illustrating Race, as well as our very talented scholars and curators and artists who've had such important input into our themes and our topic. And what I'm going to do is put up a PowerPoint that will take you through probably about 3 centuries, I imagine, of images that we will discuss. And what I'd actually like to do is to start here and just to say that in terms of Robyn's scholarship, Robyn has been working on this theme for quite a few years now. In fact, some years ago when we were working on our Four Freedoms exhibition, which Robyn was an advisor to, she was already formulating her study of the effect of published art on the way we look at the concept of race. So Robyn, I wonder if you might start by just telling us a little bit about maybe what we're seeing here, and also how you began to think about this topic and why you felt it was so important.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, and the Norman Rockwell Museum, and Laurie for the introduction. Thank you for having me on this wonderful Martin Luther King Day. This has been a really interesting journey for me because I am an illustrator. I'm also a professor, and I teach illustration and design. So this really came out of a really casual conversation or conversations I was having with some fellow illustrators of color. And we were comparing our illustration journey, things that went on, things that happened while we were creating illustrations for different platforms. And I mean, so how that process seemed different for illustrators of color. One of my illustration friends was mistaken for the delivery person when he went to deliver his illustration to a major magazine. One of my other illustrator friends was asked if he could create portraits of white people, that they only thought that he could create images of Blacks. So I started thinking about, well, if this was the contemporary idea by editors and art directors, then what might have been going on centuries ago? And what kinds of illustrations were being presented, and by whom? And who commissioned those illustrations, and for what purpose, what platforms? And I really began to discover just sort of the omissions, the blatant stereotypes, the narratives that were put in play and saturated our society for centuries. But also I discovered, some I already knew, but I also discovered how the tide of illustration and stereotypes were turned at a certain time frame. And due to the Black press and different events that happened in history. So I realized a lot of these illustrations were created specifically for certain causes, for certain identities, for certain ideas, ideals, and concepts that permeated through American history.
Robyn, you had mentioned to me that when you were beginning to explore this topic, Norman Rockwell kind of came to the surface. And this is an interesting piece called Boy in Dining Car from 1946. And it represents in many ways the way that African Americans, at least at mid-century for the major magazines, were presented, if they were presented at all. That they would have been presented in service roles, even if in the case of Rockwell, with a sense of warmth and humanity. But, there were strictures in place in terms of the way that people of color could specifically be represented. And so I wondered if you'd say a little bit about how, that idea as connected to Rockwell and others sort of influenced you.
It influenced me because during this research, I really followed the images and wrote the research and wrote the articles and the presentations around the images. One image led into another. I researched Rockwell quite a bit and realized he was unhappy with illustrating for the Saturday Evening Post. And, as racial tensions really rose during his time as an illustrator. He was very popular as an illustrator. He became really, really disenchanted with what he was doing, and knowing that his editor would not allow him to show Blacks in different roles other than subservient on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And this was one of the reasons why he chose to leave and go to Look magazine.
So maybe we can actually take people back to some of the earlier pieces that we are exploring. So for example, this is an engraving, actually on the right, that depicts 3 African slaves who were newly arrived on the shores of Virginia. And on the left, an advertisement for the sale of enslaved Africans. Do you want to sort of jump in?
This is one of the first known advertisements for that appeared and showed Blacks in the media. This was a types, and they used type specimens for these images. So this is when type and image first had a relationship with the subject matter of Blacks. And they were also used in posters, advertisements and posters.
This is an interesting piece because it was actually produced by the American Anti-Slavery Society. And I think, as you've pointed out, there were limited numbers of images that could be used, and that many were repeated on various broadsides and posters, so they would have been very familiar to the American public.
Yes, there were only a few of these images readily available to printers, so they used them for pro-slavery and anti-slavery ideas.
And this piece, interestingly, is designed to try to point out the disparity between the concept of slavery and that of freedom and democracy. So on the left-hand side, the images published by this organization deal with someone moving from freedom into slavery. And on the right-hand side, symbols of a freedom which did not coincide.
How ironic.
Yes. Harpers Weekly, Gleason's Pictorial, Drawing Room Companion, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. These were important publications, Robyn, in your research, as I understand it.
Yes, they were. They were the major newspapers of the time. They used offset printing. They used illustrators, engravers, artists, editors. Everyone was involved in creating these narratives, whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. So sometimes an illustrator would create an image and it would be changed by the engraver. So there were different points in the process of creating these newspapers where things changed, depending on who was working on the paper at that time.
Interestingly, this one actually pertains to a particular event. The central figure who's appearing as an orator is actually a reformer named Wendell Phillips. And he called this meeting, which in this illustration anyway is comprised of both whites and Blacks, to protest the case of Thomas Sims, who was a fugitive slave and was basically about to be returned to slavery. And so unfortunately, the fight for Sims' freedom did not work out very well because he was actually returned to Savannah, Georgia, where he was enslaved again.
So here, this shows one of the original illustrations for Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She commissioned the 6 original illustrations by Hammett Billings. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It sold over 300,000 copies worldwide. And there was mass hysteria around all the memorabilia, the posters, minstrel shows, theater. They even made lamps from this story. It was not copywritten, so that lent itself to many different interpretations of the story during 1852. But the main reason Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel was because she wanted more people to be sympathetic to anti-slavery. And she wanted to sow the seeds for people to understand what slavery was like. So on the left, this is one of the images, but it was one of the most important images because Uncle Tom here is a middle-aged Black man. And some people became very upset because he was middle-aged, but he was also alone with a teenage white girl who also had her hand on his knee. And in the image on the right, this is sheet music, also showing Uncle Tom as a middle-aged man.
And that representation ultimately shifts, at least to some degree, to make Uncle Tom a much more grandfatherly figure.
Yes, and really that happened based on people being upset that he was middle-aged and uncomfortable with his age and the way that he looked in illustrations of the time. So the interpretation, they interpreted him into a much older character. And he never went back. He never went back to the middle-aged Black man that he was originally written into the story to be.
This gives a sense of just how impactful the story was. It actually became, the characters were integrated not just into various literary publications, but also into advertisements such as the ones that you see here. And here, the much more grandfatherly of the depictions.
And also different versions came out of that too. Different versions, like Uncle Ben's was also a play on Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah. This is actually a rather remarkable hand-colored print. One of the ways that imagery was also widely spread, in addition to newspapers and magazines and broadsides, was through mass circulated prints that people could purchase for a relatively nominal sum. And this is called the Misogynation Ball, which refers to the intermingling of the races. And it's a fictionalized account of a Republican campaign event dance that occurred at the Lincoln Central Campaign Club in New York in September of 1864. So this is preceding Abraham Lincoln's election to a second term. And Robyn, I wonder if you want to address kind of what people are seeing here.
And this image was also interesting because it was based on a previous image called the New Union Club that was created in Britain that played on the fear and paranoia that Blacks and whites would commingle. And this is the way that America would be if Lincoln was elected. And so Lincoln won his second term, but he lost in the state of New York, where this print was widely circulated. Contemporarily, this image has shown up in the Atlantic in 2013, and also referenced by Ta-Nehisi Coates, in the Atlantic, and also the Daily Beast. So it has a lot of reference during the time of Obama's candidacy, and in different political conversations.
You know, I'll just mention that, interestingly, Kimmel and Foster, which is the print company, and then the distributor, G.W. Bromley, following Lincoln's assassination, they produced a series of prints that were very pro-Lincoln. Mm-hmm. So as Robyn points out, you know, the publishing industry was an industry that was designed to make money. And so whatever the popular themes were, there would be shifts in that regard.
I'd like to say that this is a time where the communication through text and image in Harpers Weekly and the major illustration publications that Stephanie mentioned prior during the 19th century, but also these newspapers were bound by the advancements made in printing processes. So the circulation of these papers and the kind of high-tech advancement during the time, where one played off of another. But also, as these newspapers circulated, the widespread ideas of race accompanied these advancements. The steam-driven press was invented in 1830, and with the expansion of the postal system, and helped increase the production and circulation of the papers, as did the illustrations that ran in these publications. But Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's newspaper, they were major illustrated newspapers that brought pictures of important people and news to the American public. But they were also the cheapest way to provide images to mass audiences before halftone processes. This is a piece done by Thomas Nast, one of the leading illustrators for Harper's Weekly. And he received many opportunities to illustrate these double-page spreads. He was also the creator of the political symbols for the Democrat and Republicans, the donkey and the elephant, that many of you may be familiar with. This image was, most of his images during this time were showing Blacks as, you know, straightforward and in realism. And showed some racial subtleties, but most of his work during the early part of the pre-Civil War, during Civil War, were pretty straightforward.
So interestingly, this was issued just weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation. It's actually in many ways a hopeful piece. In fact, down at the bottom, if you look closely, the New Year's baby is actually breaking the shackles of a slave. And it actually moves on the left-hand side from terrible scenes of enslavement to much more hopeful scenarios, particularly the family scene in the middle. And in fact, they're gathered around a Union stove, which I found kind of interesting. Nast himself had generally liberal points of view, which were often projected in his illustrations, though, as Robyn and I sort of have observed, he certainly presented opposite viewpoints as well.
And this piece by Nast, again, another double page spread. And this was 2 years after the previous piece that we showed. And this piece was actually done for the 4th of July. So peace on earth and goodwill towards men, but it still shows Blacks in a subservient position, being lower placed, more lowly placed in the composition, and the emphasis being on the white family. This is where, things get really interesting by illustration standards and historical standards. So as Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery was passed, but the status of 4 million Blacks was in question. So this piece was done in 1868. There are slave codes that were enacted right after emancipation. So they took the place of the slave laws. So white Southerners reestablished authority in the former Confederate states. The laws were designed to prohibit the activity, the rights, and availability of freed Blacks for labor, because the free labor no longer existed. So there was no labor. And it was sort of by any means necessary to get people to work the land and to do all of the things that slavery provided. So these Black codes turned into the Jim Crow laws of the Southern states. So these laws stood for almost a century until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1864, and the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. So this piece shows that Blacks held office in the state of Mississippi, the state of Louisiana, but also in other Southern states, however, how briefly.
I'll just mention that the full-length portrait in the center is a portrait of Oscar J. Dunn, who was Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana at the time. He is seated at the desk. And then there are 29 head and shoulders portraits of delegates to the Louisiana Constitutional Convention.
So along with the kind of breakdown of Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau was created. And this figure in the middle represented the Freedmen's Bureau. It was established in 1865 by Congress to help millions of former Black slaves and poor whites in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. So it provided food, housing, and medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. Also attempted to settle former slaves on confiscated or abandoned land during the war. It was meant to be temporary. Oliver Howard, one of its founders and the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, served as a Washington, D.C. Howard University, HBCU, who served as president from 1869 to 1864. But this image shows how free slaves and poor whites were at odds with one another because of land, and everybody was fighting over land and food and just trying to survive during that time.
So this is another work by Thomas Nast, and it's just interesting to note that in 1863, President Lincoln actually proclaimed that Thanksgiving was to be celebrated on the fourth Thursday in November. However, the Civil War actually interrupted national observance, and so it actually prevented Lincoln adversaries, old Lincoln adversaries, from accepting the proclamation. This Thanksgiving scene was published a year before it became a national holiday. And basically, it's essentially Nast's, what you might consider at the time a radical Republican vision of America after the Civil War. What is interesting about it is that Nast tried to gather what he perceived as people from nations and cultures around the world. But with having them gather around the Thanksgiving table, he doesn't necessarily consider that there may be other traditions that would supersede this particular one, which had now been established in America. And of course, you see the three presidents overseeing this dinner. So Lincoln and Washington and Grant. Robyn, did you want to add anything here?
No, not yet.
Okay, good.
Okay, so by the late 1800s, these two pieces were also created by Nast, and you can see the stylistic changes that took place. And they took place mainly because of the turning sentiment of freed slaves, and this whole idea that Blacks would be in Congress. And so on the left, he depicts Blacks in Congress, and this is how they would behave. He's depicting them as the unruly bunch, while the white members of Congress are the more calm of the group. And this gets into the civil rights. On the right, you can see the civil rights underneath the arm of the main figure. And just the idea of, if civil rights were violated, that the perpetrator would pay $500. But Nast does this in a sort of a visual, as a visual joke, really.
Yeah, interestingly, as you observe the way that Nast's drawing evolves in these pieces, it's far more caricatured than it was in some of the earlier things that we looked at. And the one on the right actually refers to the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And that was basically the last of the major Reconstruction statutes, which was supposed to guarantee African Americans equal treatment in public transportation and public accommodations and service. So you see on the right-hand side, there's somebody standing behind a desk with a guest book. And, you just, as Robyn said, I think it is a kind of a satirical point of view. And yes, businesses were supposed to be fined $1,000 if they did not comply. And people who were wronged were supposed to receive $500. I'm not sure how that really worked. Highly unlikely.
So here's an example of editors, illustrators, and artists working together. This is an engraving that shows a battle. It's created by Theodore Davis, one of the major illustrators of the time, who mainly created work that showed Native Americans and life out west. A lot of these battles were created by illustrators, but most of them were made up. Most of the illustrators never left their homes on the East Coast. This image also depicts the construction of the railroad. And so more newspapers were being sold, the more battles that were created in these images, the more newspapers were sold, but also the more people decided to uproot from the East Coast and move out west, because they were so infuriated by these ideas and these visual ideas, but they were made up. So that's where, illustrators really, grasped a lot of power, and also the pictorial press.
One of the things that's interesting to consider is that after the Civil War, publications needed to find additional dramatic events that would help them to sell their publications.
Mm-hmm.
And Theodore Davis was actually considered one of what they called the special illustrators, who actually would go out west and kind of insert himself into various scenarios that were happening. So this notion of manifest destiny, a movement out west, and the battle between Native people and others, whites going out west, was a constant and regular topic. And it was meant to create both a sense of fear and a sense of fascination.
Here is an image by Sol Attenge, who was a kind of a satirical comic illustrator for Harpers Weekly. He created a series for the small breeds, and in this sort of magical place or fictional place called Blackville. And these images were sort of like a visual comedy of Blacks doing absurd things. He would depict Blacks with bulging eyes, big lips, and doing something absurd. And the end result of this series was that Harper's Weekly sold more newspapers. So it was sort of a sitcom in print media, as it were. People would sort of tune in for each episode of the small breeds, by buying these newspapers. The Darktown series by Currier and Ives, the print house, they picked up on the idea of creating these series, and they printed these absurd images in color. And one of the they gained momentum after one of these prints sold 75,000 copies. The prints were also collected worldwide and by the English royalty. So these images by Currier and Ives were mass created and mass collected.
Yeah, it's actually remarkable to think about the numbers in which they were absorbed into society. They began publishing the Darktown comic series in 1870, and by 1884, it represented a third of their overall production. So you can see how pervasive this scenario would have been.
What's also interesting too is that if you Google Currier and Ives, and Stephanie and I have done this, what will come up is, sort of puppies and flowers, and, it's very, very difficult contemporarily to find these images associated with Currier and Ives. They're buried sort of deep into the internet searches.
Mm-hmm.
The city of New York was the center of American art through its artists, publishing, and theater. It played a major role in the development of minstrelsy and the negative images of Blacks in popular media, and spread of Southern notions about Blacks in the North through exaggeration and simplification of imagery. So most of the minstrel shows were an expression of plantation myths, like of plantation life and the myths around that. Also functioned to create an image of Blacks and to promote white Southern interests, such as Jim Crow, and believed that most whites in the North believed that what was going on in these minstrel shows and plantation life and everything associated with it was factual, when it was in fact not.
One of the ways that stereotypical imagery was circulated was through advertisements and trade cards. And particularly with trade cards, it was a very inexpensive way for advertisers to circulate visuals that promoted their products.
Also, the Charles Darwin's popular theory of evolution was really popular during that time, and where humans were evolved from a primitive ape. And this really started in 1859. So a lot of this Darwinism came forth in the advertising cards. So manufacturers look to advertise and communicate about inventions, products, and services before the end of the Civil War. And it contained a lot of the racist imagery. But after the Civil War, Blacks began to live in their own communities and members of the working class with limited freedoms. So these illustrations were used for food labels, appliances, cars. Some of the companies were Van Heusen, General Electric, Kellogg's, B&G Foods, Borden's. That's just to name a few. One of the famous images is this portrait of Nancy Greene for R.T. Davis Milling Company, the company that created Aunt Jemima pancake flour. She's the first living advertising trademark. So Nancy Greene is a real person, and she went around to trade shows and festivals and fairs representing the company. But this illustration of Nancy Greene was created by A.B. Frost. And so the stereotypes affected how Black women saw themselves, and the headscarf and it represented a whole idea around hair and the treatment of the hair. So hats and headscarves were, had social codes attached to them. And so there were these layers of what images like this represented.
Sorry.
The mammy, the mammy was, kind of a made up character to represent how this person who was supposed to cook, clean, and take care of the house on the plantation. So it was this character. Not only was it Nancy Greene in this painting, but it was, this mass representation of, Southern comfort on the plantations.
And you can see how the image of Aunt Jemima was integrated into a variety of advertisements. And of course, the Quaker Oats Company did very recently acknowledge that Aunt Jemima was based upon a racial stereotype and stopped using that.
Most of these images, solidified Blacks in a subservient role. Also in the character of Rastus for the cream of wheat. Uncle Ben's also.
Yeah, interestingly, Rastus is the name of an African-American character who first appeared on packages of cream of wheat cereal in 1893. And his image remained on the packaging until the 1920s. But he was ultimately replaced by a photograph of Frank White, who was a Chicago chef in a chef's hat. But the name Rastus actually came down through Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus stories. There was a character named Brer Rastus in the stories. But it is amazing the number of American illustrators who actually used Rastus or painted Rastus in a variety of scenarios. So here on the left, we have a drawing by Jesse Wilcox Smith. And this would have been a fairly typical scenario where there would be a white child either interacting with a picture of Rastus or being overseen by Rastus or served cereal by this character.
This is another piece by A.B. Frost. A.B. Frost did the original portrait of Nancy Greene, Aunt Jemima. And so this is also a piece done in pen and ink by A.B. Frost. So the illustrators of the time, they used different mediums. They, and for different reasons. So, you know, he created an image for advertisement, but here's also an editorial sort of comic type piece for Life magazine.
And of course, the characteristics of each figure are vastly exaggerated in comparison to this piece, which is also by Frost, which has much more psychological and subtle undertones and is much more naturalistically painted.
I found a lot of these, you know, comparative illustrations to be fascinating in my research. Like one illustrator could do create a range of images, but also use a range of medium to do this, depending on who the illustrator worked for, depending on who the editorial or director was, or the art director was, and whatever the purpose, you know, they would change what their style was, and how stereotypical they would make Blacks. So it was really interesting to me, you know, again, the power of the illustration. So magazines like Puck, they made a lot of money circulating their magazines using these images for immigration and making fun of most ethnicities who immigrated to the United States. And as you can see, you know, Uncle Sam kind of commanding the room, where everyone is, every non-white character here is stylized in some way, in a stereotypical way, and the white children are in the back, you know, being dutifully reading their books.
And oftentimes works like this would be tied to a particular historical event that was happening at the time. So for example, the Spanish-American War occurred in 1898, and its concluding treaty was actually signed just 1 month before Puck published this. So one major component of that treaty was that Spain gave the United States control over the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So you start to see that reflected here in the characters, and, you know, then of course in the way that the characters are drawn.
Mm-hmm. These ideas worked through different magazines of the time, like the Saturday Evening Post. This version of the assimilation into America But notice there are no women. So there are all kinds of messages, ingrained in these illustrations of the time.
And this piece, published in 1921, relates to the Emergency Quota Act that year, which actually established the nation's first numerical limit on the number of immigrants who could enter the United States. And then in 1924, the Immigration Act actually even tightened those limits. That was known as the National Origins Act. But the notion that just by changing the headgear of individuals coming into the country would establish them as Americans, tried and true Americans, is an interesting one to consider.
And then we have the Wasp magazine, that was an anti-Chinese satirical magazine of the late 1800s. So this illustration was in response to thousands of Chinese immigrating to California for the gold rush, and then later on for the railroad. So as Chinese laborers grew, and a lot of them became really successful, anti-Chinese sentiment followed that. And with it, legislation to limit future immigration of Chinese workers, known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. So here we have an image for the Crisis magazine that it showed the violence that Blacks were escaping in the South. So lynching and mob violence accompanied the Jim Crow laws. And as a result, 250 to 500,000 Black people left the South. They also left the Caribbean for cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York in pursuit of better jobs, education, living conditions, and escaping the mob violence. And so, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Well, I'll just mention that the Crisis was the legendary African-American magazine that began publication in 1910. And it actually remains in print today. It was published under the sponsorship of the NAACP, and it was the most widely read and distributed magazine of the Harlem Renaissance. And it was created by Chief Editor W.E.B. Du Bois, who oversaw the publication until 1933. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that Du Bois actually encouraged artists of color to use their art to move forward aspects of social justice, and many did.
And so with the migration came writers, musicians, and artists. New York became the central point of the concept of the New Negro movement, a concept by Elaine Lope to move the idea of the Black race from the plantation slave to a more progressive and sophisticated intellectual Negro. This marked the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. And so Aaron Douglas, as you see in these two pieces by Aaron Douglas, he was tasked with sort of changing that identity of who Americans associated Blacks to be. And it was because of his distinctive graphic style that encompassed African forms with modernism. He and other Black illustrators created illustrations mainly for Black owned and edited publications like The Crisis and The Opportunity.
These are examples of other publications that also featured literature and artwork by African-American artists. Gwendolyn Bennett is actually featured on the left in Opportunity, a journal of Negro life. And that basically chronicled cultural advancements during the Harlem Renaissance. And Gwendolyn Bennett was an artist, a writer, and a journalist. And on the right-hand side, a piece done about 10 years later, very strong piece by Aaron Douglas.
And also a cover of The Crisis.
This is by William McKnight-Farrow, who was an artist and curator in the early 20th century. And he was recognized as a printmaker in his own right. But, it's really a beautiful, almost Art Nouveau design, and using Art Deco styles, coupled in a very natural setting, vacation setting. So really important introduction of themes such as this. Another important artist of the Harlem Renaissance was Lois Maylor Jones. And one of the things that was very interesting to Robyn and I is that she was among the first artists to begin introducing African-American children into picture books. It's widely thought that Ezra Jack Keats' The Snowy Day was the first to do this, but these are actually quite a bit earlier in the 1920s and 30s. And again, very beautiful, stylized, but magical introduction of children.
And you can see how diverse the styles are, by Black illustrators, and just this whole identity change. And even though the publications were Black owned, I mean, there was such an expression, of pride and beauty. This is Charles Dawson, an illustrator and graphic designer in Chicago. And this poster was for the Chicago World Fair. It's Oh, Sing a New Song. This was in 1933. He also created all of the images and design work for the Valmer's Black Hair Care company that was owned and operated by a Jewish husband and wife team for nearly 60 years.
During the mid-20th century, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, American magazines portrayed generally people of color in roles of servitude, but there were some tropes that came up over and over again. And so, for example, in the work on the left by J.C. Liondecker, there was a trope of laziness. So, for example, this notion of someone kind of sweeping dirt under the rug. And on the right-hand side, someone who serves as a porter for a wealthy white individual. These were themes that came up fairly frequently.
And Liondecker was one of the most prominent illustrators and painters, in the 20th century. He was one of the main illustrators for the golden age of illustrators, who were, there were none of illustrators of color. He illustrated over 400 magazine covers, mainly for the Saturday Evening Post, where all of the Blacks and Native Americans that he showed, which wasn't very many, they were in subservient or stereotypical roles on the cover.
And Liondecker was a mentor to Rockwell. Liondecker was about 20 years older than Rockwell. And Rockwell basically subsumed his role as the main illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post when Liondecker did his last cover in the 1940s.
Also, I'd like to say that the images of Blacks and lifestyle was largely ignored in mainstream magazines. So those images were really the only ones that mainstream Americans ever saw.
Yeah. During World War II, there was attention given to Dory Miller, who was a U.S. Navy cook third class who was killed in action during World War II. And he was actually the first Black American to be awarded the Navy Cross, which is the highest decoration for valor in combat. And you see him wearing the cross in the poster on the right-hand side. The cartoon on the left by Charles Henry Alston refers to the fact that Miller served aboard the battleship West Virginia, which was sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers during the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But during that attack, he helped save several soldiers. And he was actually manning an anti-aircraft machine gun for which he had had no training. And he did bring down several Japanese planes. And the interesting thing is that he became a hero also in the Black press, who really viewed Miller as the kind of hero that would move civil rights forward. But he was ultimately killed while serving aboard the escort carrier Liscombe Bay when it was sunk by a Japanese submarine.
So
go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry. That his image on the right, he became the subject for recruiting, a recruiting poster, as you see here, that pursued Blacks and to join the military. And in this illustration by David Stone Martin. So there were illustrators, when I was researching through this time period, I was wondering, like, where are all of the Black illustrators and the illustrations? So there were people like, as we just discussed, Charles Alston, but also Elton Fax. This is an Elton Fax piece here, and also E. Sims Campbell. But most of these illustrators, if not, and others, had to hide their identity to be able to work for any major magazines. One of the treats for me as being a grad student up in Syracuse in the late 90s, I was able to meet Elton Fax, who was a alumni of Syracuse's painting department, and he also went to school with Tom Lovell. So I was thrilled when some curator friends of mine created a solo show for Elton Fax. It was one of his last exhibitions in New York.
And E. Sims Campbell is a very interesting story. He was an American commercial artist. He was best known as a cartoonist, and he signed himself, his work as E. Sims Campbell. But he was the first African-American cartoonist published in nationally distributed slick magazines. He was simultaneously doing work for the Black press, as well as I say, the slicks. And he did quite a bit of work for Esquire. The piece on the right is this beautifully complex map of the nightclubs in Harlem. And on the left, a very poignant piece, comical but poignant, of a woman trying to decide on hairstyles from a sheet that only portrays whites. He became well known for a syndicated series actually called Cuties, which you see here. And as I mentioned, he also did a lot of work for Esquire.
And I believe
Publications in which his work appeared were the Chicagoan, Cosmopolitan, Ebony, the New Yorker, Playboy, Opportunity, Life, Pictorial Review, and Redbook. So he was very, very busy.
And I don't think that most people knew during the time that he was a Black illustrator. I think he hid most of that when he was illustrating for Esquire and the major magazines that circulated to white readership.
Yes, which largely portrayed white characters, as you see here.
And they were afraid they would lose their readership if people knew. So the civil rights era was a time of turbulence as there were boycotts, strikes, and violence in the struggle for justice and equity for African Americans. Illustrations depicted main leaders of these events in drawings and comics in the Black press. And also these courtroom images that you see with Rosa Parks and Montgomery bus boycott by Harvey Dinnerstein.
Yeah, Harvey Dinnerstein and Burton Silverman, very prominent and now senior artists. They actually were observers at this very important event in American history when Rosa Parks was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct on December 1st, 1955, when she refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white man. And they were actually present in the courtroom at her trial and did a series of drawings portraying these events, which are now in the collection of the Delaware Art Museum.
And so these two pieces are, comics of the time, where the one on the left, the Martin Luther King and Montgomery story, that was circulated worldwide, Mexico and Europe. So it had wide readership. And as you can see, 10 cents for the publication. And Tom Feelings on the right. And Tom Feelings was really dedicated to trying to show people what it was like for Black families to try to own a home and dealing with ideas and concepts of the realism of redlining and how the transit and construction of highways would cut through neighborhoods and what was left of those spaces for Black people to live. So this is what it really shows on the right.
I'll just mention that the piece on the left, the Montgomery story, had tremendous impact. It was actually illustrated by Cy Barry, who had illustrated The Phantom for 3 decades. And he was selected to create the 16-page comic that was circulated very widely, even internationally. It was circulated to community organizations and churches, and it really promoted Martin Luther King's concept of nonviolent protest. So, even a modest comic book like this had very far reach.
And so these are some pieces by Ollie Harrington, who was a popular illustrator for the Chicago Defender. And so these images show sort of the plight of Black children sort of growing up in these cities and trying to be educated and being threatened by the police and just sort of navigating all of the pitfalls that they were subjected to during the 60s.
And of course, the pieces on the left and the right really have reference to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court that stated that separate was not equal in America's public schools, and yet it took quite a few years before schools really began to be integrated. And that is, of course, the subject that this work by Norman Rockwell refers to. This was the first artwork that Rockwell did for Look magazine after he left the Saturday Evening Post in 1963 after 47 years. And it refers to the experience of young Black children, and specifically Ruby Bridges, who was the first to integrate the William Franz Elementary School in New Orleans in 1960. And this was published actually at the 10th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling.
And Rockwell was tired of creating American imagery that largely ignored real problems of society at the time and of civil rights movement. And he was urged by Black activist Roderick Stevens to create imagery depicting Blacks in a more progressive light and more broadly show the country that many positive attributes of Black people.
Yes, thank you, Robyn. That was an important point. He did have direct contact with a number of civil rights advocates, and he became a lifetime member of the NAACP. And we do have some interesting correspondence in the museum's archives relating to that. Mm-hmm. But as you say, he was specifically requested to turn his talents to this subject. And I really think it got him thinking about how important that would be, because at this point in his life, he really had the trust of of many Americans, and he was a kind of an elder statesman.
And Emory Douglas was one of the main illustrators of the Black Panther newspaper, an instrument for social justice. The paper concentrated on the poor and oppressed. And a quote by Colette Gaither, she's my colleague at University of Delaware. He was considered the Norman Rockwell of the ghetto by maintaining poor people's dignity while graphically illustrating the harsh situations and conditions that poor people lived in.
He was actually he was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party in 1967 until it disbanded in the 1980s. And, much of his focus, as you may know, was focused on police brutality and interactions of people of color with police.
And with the 70s, just brought mainstream Black illustration for book covers. Here's a piece by Charles Lilly on a very, very important and widely circulated book, Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And this piece, this is a piece in the book by Middle Passage by Tom Feelings. Tom Feelings spent 20 years on the images for this book. So he started this in the late or early 70s, and it was published in, I believe, 1995.
Yeah, very, very powerful works now in the collection of the Beinecke Library at Yale University. But essentially, it was a book that he hoped would allow people to really bear witness to the sufferings of those who were brought to the Americas without their consent. And Jerry Pinkney, I just want to mention, who sadly passed away this year, way too soon. We are actually dedicating the exhibition and its catalog to Jerry, who we at the Norman Rockwell Museum have had tremendous good fortune to work with over the course of about 20 years through exhibitions and programs. And, Jerry talked a lot about the fact that as a young person growing up, and even as a young artist, he did not have artists of color to look to, or even represent, or positive representations in books that he was reading. And so he really made it his passion to research and study and bring both fictional stories as well as stories of real life to light. And this is actually a cover illustration for The Old African, which is a kind of a folk tale about the Igbo people who were brought through slavery to this country, but then mythically determined to travel back to their native home.
I'd like to also say that Jerry Pinkney was the first Black faculty member in the Department of Art at the University of Delaware. So that's where I met him when I first started at Delaware 25 years ago. So he was an assistant professor there and went on to create just these fantastic illustrated books and images for the world.
And, we see that, as Robyn pointed out, in many different ways, in many different styles now, there's really beautiful work being created by young artists like Lois Wise, who's based now in California, for major publications, and important work by Rudy Gutierrez, who teaches at Pratt Institute for the music industry. Robyn, do you want to mention a little about Rudy? I know you know him well.
Yeah, Rudy is an art activist, and he's always, making images to speak to everyone. In this piece on the right, he worked with Hollis King on this as the art director, and I believe this piece won the best album cover image of the year.
Yes.
So
best jazz album of the year. So that was exciting. And we wanted to mention this trilogy called March, which documents the life and times and work towards civil rights efforts by the late Congressman John Lewis. It's actually illustrated by Nate Powell.
oh,
And it has come out in 3 volumes, the first in 2013, the second in 2015, and the third in 2020.
it's really wonderfully done and also packaged together so you get the entire story of his life.
And
Yeah,
here's
really.
an interior illustration, which is very strong. I'm the only one still around, and now unfortunately he's not either. And we'll end with just a couple of works by the noted illustrator Kadir Nelson. This particular piece, called Say Their Names, was published by the New Yorker on June 22nd, 2020, following the murder of George Floyd. And within the figure, you can see that Kadir has paid tribute both to very specific people who have been murdered, as well as those who are unnamed. And this has really become a very powerful emblem for our time and the subject that we're currently exploring. Robyn, do you want to bring up an end note?
Just another piece by Kadir Nelson, and just sort of this image representing the wonderment and hope of America to come and images to come. And it's a great value and privilege to have the skill to express your ideas and thoughts into illustrated imagery. And with that privilege comes the responsibility and power and influence it can have as a persuasive and communicative tool to speak to mass audiences. To understand the power and persuasive impact illustrators have had on society's perceptions of non-whites is to study the history of race and the link between it and illustrated imagery over that period of time. So promoting ideas through the creation of imagery that celebrates, normalizes, and connects the visual story of people of color is essential to an inclusive discussion of race.
Well, we have kept you all too long, and we thank you so much for joining us today. Robyn, thank you for your outstanding comments and the wonderful work you're doing on this show. We're so grateful.
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to be a co-curator.
We have just a couple of questions that have come in, and let's see. One of them is there a plan to incorporate this beautiful work into the K-12 ethnic studies curriculum? I will just mention that, very fortunately, we will be creating curriculum following some of the themes in this exhibition for K-12 students. So yeah, we're
looking forward to it.
Looking forward to that. Yeah, for sure. Let's see what else we've got. Okay, so the one question is from Roger Reed, actually. Was it Stowe who commissioned Billings to illustrate Uncle Tom's Cabin or the publishers?
Harry Beecher Stowe wanted Billings specifically for his style and his straightforward depiction of Blacks. So she was very particular about that.
And then Roger said, I'm unclear as to whether the Misogynation Ball was fiction or just this depiction of it.
It was fiction.
Yeah, and in fact, the print, interestingly, in the fine print down at the bottom, proclaims it to be true, of course. But no.
Yeah, I mean, so it's, this whole idea of news, people believed whatever they saw, and that's where illustration became so powerful back then. It's because no one had television, no one had radio. So whatever was created was true, even though it wasn't necessarily.
And then Brendan asks, there were trade cards and advertisements that featured white people, correct? It would be interesting to see the juxtaposition between the two. Yes, in fact, that is the case. And the juxtapositions are really very interesting in terms of the way that the white characters were drawn, which were much more naturalistically than the way that Black characters were drawn.
And most of the trade cards were of the time used Blacks because of that subservient, the labor. So just coming out of emancipation and who actually, did labor in the country. So there were these ideals of the comfort of the old South and the way things were. So people became comfortable in seeing those things in print.
And Robyn, this is one that you might want to address. Why were African-American characters used in marketing of food products such as syrup, Aunt Jemima? Why not white American characters for those products? Do you want to offer a thought about that?
Namely because, mostly because, again, that's the ideal of who cooked the food in the South and that comfort level, and how those ideals moved north, as the minstrel shows really had a hand in that, the ideals of plantation life and, the mammy, the who worked on the plantation. So people had these ideals of who cooked the best food and who cleaned the best houses, or who cleaned the best in the house. And it was back to this plantation, the idea of being on the plantation. So they moved those concepts over to food labels and products and services.
Yeah, it's kind of that the romanticization
yeah.
that even occurred in the minstrel shows
Exactly.
that we were discussing a little bit earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it sold a lot of products.
Yes, they sure did. Question here, how do you see these depictions of people in illustrative images over time connected to the current push to ban children's books primarily by Black authors and illustrators?
Can you say that first part of the question?
Yeah. How do you see these depictions of people in illustrative images over time connected to a current push to ban children's books, primarily by Black authors and illustrators?
Yeah, it was interesting that banning books kind of comes in waves.
Yeah.
Because this isn't the first time this has come up. The Daughters of the Confederacy campaigned at a certain time in I think it was the late 1800s, where they campaigned to have books banned coming from Northern publishing companies. So even books that were just printed and distributed by Northern book companies, they didn't want those ideals even in certain Southern states.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a connection through history repeating itself. Really, I mean, and Stephanie and I found so many parallels of history repeating itself. Illustrations for voter suppression and again, children's books. So it's really prevalent throughout historical events.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of this, not a positive one necessarily, but that so much of what we are seeing in images of the past are the very same issues that we continue to recount and rehash. And I think people will find that very surprising when they see the exhibition.
I think so too.
Yeah. I'll just mention one more from Dennis Dietrich. Dennis, thank you for that mention of Edward Campbell. Absolutely. Yeah, we didn't quite get everything in here, but Edward Campbell being so important as an illustrator for Mark Twain and many others. So thank you for that. Well, we are most grateful for all the time you spent with us today. We will look forward to welcoming you to the exhibition next June. If you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can always be reached at splunkett@nrm.org and convey anything to Robyn. And Robyn, thank you again. It's just been such an honor and a pleasure to work with you. And more to come. We are looking forward to it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.